3 Roman legions, 30,000 men, vanished in a forest, leaving no survivors. The most powerful army the world had ever seen, defeated not by another empire, but by tribes the Romans called Barbarians. How could the greatest military machine in history be ambushed so completely? And who was the man behind it, a Roman-trained officer turned enemy? In the shadows of Germania, a conspiracy unfolded that would shake the empire to its core and change the course of Europe forever. The Roman Empire at the dawn of the 1st century AD seemed unstoppable. From the deserts of Africa to the forests of Germany, legions marched with disciplined precision, carrying the weight of civilization itself. The empire's borders were marked not just by walls and roads, but by the fear it instilled in those beyond its grasp. And yet, in the dense, misty woods of Germania, an unseen force waited. Arminius, a Cherusci noble, had been trained in the ways of Rome. He knew its strategies, understood its formations, and could anticipate its moves. Yet, behind his loyalty lay a secret. Arminius had returned to his people with a plan that would shock the empire. Using his knowledge of Roman discipline, he forged alliances with neighboring tribes, the Cherusci, the Bructeri, and others, uniting them under a single, deadly purpose. As the Roman legions advanced in 9 AD under the command of Publius Quinctilius Varus, they were confident. Marching through narrow forest paths, their soldiers were armored, disciplined, and armed to perfection. But every step deeper into the Teutoburg Forest brought them closer to a trap they could not see. Hidden in the undergrowth, warriors moved silently, leaving signs of their presence only where they wanted the Romans to notice. When the ambush struck, chaos erupted. Roman formations collapsed under relentless attacks from the woods. Archers fired from concealed positions, while tribesmen struck at flanks and supply lines. The disciplined legions, trained to conquer cities, found themselves fighting in a landscape that favored the enemy. For 3 days, the forest became a crucible of destruction. By the end, Varus and tens of thousands of Roman soldiers were dead, and the survivors scattered. This was more than a battle. It was a psychological shock that resonated throughout the empire. Rome, accustomed to dominance, had never faced such a decisive defeat at the hands of what it considered primitive enemies. The Teutoburg Forest would become a symbol of vulnerability, a reminder that the mightiest army could be undone by strategy, cunning, and the intimate knowledge of its own tactics. But the story did not end with the ambush. Arminius had not only destroyed legions, he had planted fear deep within the Roman psyche. Emperors feared reprisals, generals hesitated, and Rome's expansion into Germania slowed for decades. In secret, the empire adjusted its strategies, building fortifications along the Rhine, and creating new military doctrines to prevent such a catastrophe from repeating. Yet Arminius remained a shadowy figure, celebrated by his people as a liberator, and condemned by Rome as a traitor. Even today, historians debate the true scale of the ambush. How could 3 entire legions vanish almost without a trace? What intelligence failures allowed Arminius to deceive Varus completely? And perhaps most haunting, if Rome could be struck so effectively in 9 AD, what other hidden threats lay beyond the empire's knowledge, waiting for the right moment? The Teutoburg Forest was not merely a battle. It was a turning point. It exposed the fragile line between empire and collapse, showing that power is never absolute, and even the mightiest civilization can be undone by human ingenuity and courage. And for the tribes of Germania, it was a triumph that echoed across generations. a victory that would forever haunt Rome's northern frontier. Rome thought it had learned its lesson. But across the northern forests, a new generation of warriors was rising. Men like Segimir would soon challenge the empire in ways Rome could not foresee, testing its strength, strategy, and resolve once more. Rome had survived Teutoburg, yet the northern forests remained restless. The empire had expanded its roads, forts, and garrisons, but beyond the Rhine, small bands of warriors continued to resist. Among them, one man stood out: Segimir, a tribal leader whose cunning and audacity challenged Rome in ways no one expected. Segimir's people were scattered across the dense forests and marshlands, skilled in the art of ambush and deception. Unlike the Roman legions, which relied on strict formations and heavy armor, these warriors moved with the landscape, striking swiftly and disappearing before the Romans could respond. Segimir studied the empire, learning its weaknesses not in grand battles, but in subtle patterns: the supply lines, the predictable patrols, the reliance on fortified camps. In the dead of winter, he launched his first raids. Roman settlements along the Rhine found their granaries burned and messengers intercepted. The empire's governors, confident that their legions could crush any opposition, were caught off guard. Segimir avoided direct confrontation, understanding that victory lay in wearing the Romans down, not defeating them in open battle. Each strike sowed fear and uncertainty, forcing the legions to spread thinner across the frontier, struggling to guard every path and river crossing. The Romans responded with discipline, building forts and sending patrols to flush out the rebels. Yet the forests themselves seemed to conspire with Segimir. Ambushes sprang from seemingly empty thickets. Supply convoys were lost in the snow, disappearing as if swallowed by the land. The empire's reputation for invincibility wavered. Soldiers who had once mocked the tribes now feared the silent, relentless attacks that could strike at any moment. Segimir's tactics were more than mere guerrilla warfare. They were psychological. The tribes whispered of omens and ancient powers, making the Romans question what they could not see. Every surprise attack, every vanished convoy, built a legend around Segimir and his warriors. To the Romans, he was an enigma, a barbarian who anticipated their moves, outsmarted their generals, and used the terrain as a weapon. To his people, he was a symbol of defiance, a man proving that the empire's vastness was not invincible. Yet Segimir's campaigns were not chaos without strategy. He understood the limits of his forces and the importance of alliances. Neighboring tribes, once independent or even hostile to one another, joined under his leadership, forming a coalition that could challenge Rome's northern garrisons more effectively. Letters smuggled through secret routes documented victories and tactics, while Roman spies reported a growing network of organized resistance that refused to be crushed by intimidation or bribery. For the empire, these northern uprisings were a constant headache. Troops trained to fight in open fields now found themselves trapped in forests and marshes where every step could be an ambush. Forts were reinforced, roads patrolled continuously, and punishments for insurgents became harsher. Yet each measure played into Segimir's plan, slowing Roman response and exhausting the legions. He forced Rome to acknowledge that even the most disciplined army could be manipulated by knowledge, patience, and cunning. The struggle in the north was a battle of wits as much as weapons. Segimir and his warriors demonstrated that empires, no matter how vast, were vulnerable when facing enemies who understood the land and exploited every weakness. Rome could conquer cities and build roads, but it could not dominate the spirit of men determined to resist. The northern forests remained a place where the empire's authority was tested, where legions learned humility, and where the concept of invincibility slowly eroded. Through winter raids, covert alliances, and calculated strikes, Segimir showed that the barbarians were not merely obstacles. They were teachers, forcing Rome to adapt and reconsider the limits of its power. And while the empire survived, the shadow of resistance persisted, a constant reminder that domination was never complete, and that even a small, determined force could challenge the greatest power in the world. Rome's influence stretched across continents, yet its northern and western frontiers remained fragile. Roads, forts, and walls marked the empire's power, but in Gaul and Britain, restless peoples refused to bow. Boudica's name would later echo through history as a symbol of rebellion, yet she was only one of countless tribal leaders who challenged Rome's authority, their stories almost erased by time. In the forests of Gaul, tribes coordinated raids with remarkable precision. They struck Roman settlements in the dead of night, targeting supply depots, patrols, and isolated garrisons. Forts built to protect the empire were often too few, too distant, and too predictable. Roman soldiers, trained for open-field battles, were vulnerable in forests and marshes, where every tree could conceal an enemy, and every path could lead to an ambush. Across the sea in Britain, the Iceni and other tribes resisted fiercely. Under Boudica, they rose with a combination of ferocity and strategy, exploiting the empire's weaknesses. Roman towns were set ablaze, their walls no barrier against the fury of those determined to reclaim their homeland. The rebellion spread quickly, fueled by a shared desire for autonomy and the memory of injustices committed under Roman rule. The Romans responded with brutal efficiency, marshalling legions to suppress uprisings and punish those who dared defy them. Yet the tribes adapted. Guerrilla tactics, hit-and-run raids, and sudden offensives kept Roman forces off balance. Even the most disciplined legions faced chaos, their formations broken in narrow streets and dense woods, their numbers unable to secure every village, every crossing, every river. What set these rebellions apart was not just the physical resistance, but the psychological impact. Tribes communicated through signals, rumors, and coded movements, creating uncertainty within the empire. Roman governors hesitated, generals second-guessed their strategies, and soldiers feared what might lie ahead. The illusion of Roman control was constantly challenged, showing that authority could be undermined without a single pitched battle. Yet these conflicts were not merely destructive. They were lessons in resilience and adaptation. Rome learned to build new fortifications, improve supply lines, and develop flexible military tactics. Roads were rerouted, patrols increased, and alliances were negotiated with local leaders. Still, even with these measures, rebellion never fully vanished. The frontier remained a place of tension, a zone where the empire's power was contested daily, where legions could conquer territory, but not entirely subdue the spirit of the people. The Celtic and British uprisings also revealed a deeper truth. Empires are not only tested by armies, but by culture, identity, and memory. For the tribes, resistance was as much about preserving traditions and autonomy as it was about military victory. For Rome, it was a constant reminder that conquest does not guarantee obedience, and that the spirit of freedom cannot be captured by walls or legions. Across Gaul and Britain, small victories against the empire inspired others. Word of burned towns, ambushed legions, and daring raids spread from village to village. These acts of defiance became legend, teaching future generations that even the most powerful empire could be challenged. Rome's reach was vast, but its hold was never absolute. By the end of these rebellions, the empire had gained experience, discipline, and knowledge. But the cost was high. Cities destroyed, roads threatened, and countless lives lost. And though Rome prevailed in the short term, the legacy of resistance endured. It shaped military strategy, informed frontier policy, and left a mark on history that few textbooks dare to emphasize. The frontier remained a proving ground, a place where the clash between civilization and rebellion was never fully resolved. Rome could claim victory on the battlefield, yet the ember of revolt smoldered in the forests, marshes, and hills of Gaul and Britain. And as the empire looked north and west, it became clear that conquest was not enough. Understanding the will and cunning of those it sought to control was an entirely different challenge, one that would define the fate of Rome's borders for centuries to come. Rome had survived ambushes, rebellions, and uprisings, from the forests of Germania to the marshes of Britain. Legions marched, forts were built, and roads stretched across continents. But the empire had learned a crucial truth: power alone could not secure obedience. The barbarians at the gates were not merely obstacles, they were teachers, shaping Rome's strategies and testing the limits of its authority. Across the northern frontiers, the echoes of Arminius, Segimir, Boudicca, and countless unnamed leaders lingered. Their victories were small, fragmentary, yet cumulative, forcing Rome to adapt. Fortifications along the Rhine were reinforced. Patrols became more flexible. Supply lines were rerouted and strengthened. Governors and generals developed contingency plans for ambushes and uprisings. Every encounter etched lessons into the empire's collective memory. Rome's military innovation was a direct response to resistance. The empire learned to combine brute force with intelligence, diplomacy, and psychological tactics. Tribal alliances were monitored, local leaders co-opted, and networks of informants established. Rome's legions became less rigid, more mobile, and capable of operating in hostile terrain, forests, rivers, and hills that once gave the barbarians a decisive advantage. Yet, despite all adaptations, complete control remained elusive. No matter how many fortresses were raised or legions stationed, the spirit of defiance could not be extinguished. The barbarians exploited local knowledge, terrain, and surprise, forcing Rome to acknowledge that conquest was never absolute. These lessons shaped not just military strategy, but politics, administration, and governance, reinforcing the need for vigilance along every frontier. Beyond the battlefield, these conflicts left a lasting cultural impact. Rome absorbed certain customs, technologies, and strategies from the tribes it fought, blending them into its own systems. The empire's borders were not just lines on a map. They were zones of constant negotiation, adaptation, and compromise. And the tribes themselves, though ultimately subdued in many regions, preserved traditions that would influence Europe long after Rome's legions had retreated. The northern and western uprisings revealed a paradox that would define the empire. Rome could conquer cities, but it could not conquer hearts entirely. It could impose order, but the human desire for autonomy, the cunning of those who knew the land, and the unpredictability of resistance remained outside the empire's grasp. Power without understanding was fragile, and Rome's survival depended as much on adaptation as on force. The empire's edge became a proving ground for innovation. Lessons learned in Germania, Gaul, and Britain shaped future campaigns, frontier policies, and even the strategies of emperors centuries later. The barbarians, often dismissed as peripheral or insignificant, had left an indelible mark on the greatest empire the world had ever known. Rome's story was not only one of conquest, it was one of resilience, adaptation, and the constant tension between domination and defiance. The northern forests and rebellious tribes were more than a challenge. They were a mirror, reflecting Rome's strengths and weaknesses. Each clash honed the empire, forcing it to grow smarter, faster, and more resilient. The legions that marched after these encounters carried not only weapons, but the hard-earned knowledge that victory is never guaranteed, and that even the mightiest power must respect the will of those it seeks to control. Rome may have built roads that stretched to the ends of the known world, but the battles that history almost forgot reveal a different story, one where cunning, courage, and resistance shaped the empire as much as conquest. From Arminius in the forests to Boudicca in Britain, the barbarians left lessons etched into Rome's very soul. Power could take cities, but it could not erase spirit. And as the empire endured, adapting to every threat, the question remained: did Rome truly dominate, or did it merely learn to coexist with the forces it could never fully conquer? The frontier always tested the empire, and it always remembered